I blinked awake from the movement of the jeep. The road was bumpy, and I held the backpack in my hands. I traveled light, carrying my few possessions, the most precious of which were my journal and notes, the reason why I had come in the first place. I viewed the untouched wilderness, barely touched by humanity. The air was humid and thick. My clothes coated my body. Sweat caused them to stick as I struck a stray branch with a machete. The vegetation was dense. Every leaf felt like an insect was ready and waiting to crawl on my skin. Wiping the sweat from my brow line, I approached the encampment where I would be staying while conducting my research. If everything went according to plan, I would be here for 3 months investigating a rare fungi that could be a cure for cancer. In mortui et mortuius was rumored to kill cancer cells and restore the body's natural healing. There were 5 tents set up with an eating area, and there were people walking or organizing things inside the camp. "Dr. Sear," I heard an upper-crust British accent politely call out to me, and turned to see. A plump, middle-aged man with graying hair smiled at me. A stubby hand offered in an enthusiastic greeting. He too was coated in sweat. His skin had a ruddy red appearance, and he didn't seem to tolerate the heat well. He looked out of place here, better suited to studying inside a cozy university instead. "You must be here to investigate the new species. Fungi, was it?" He explained, rummaging around his shirt for paperwork. He flipped through them, nearly dropping stray pieces on the floor, and I smiled, politely putting up my hand. "No need, Dr. Everstock. I remember seeing your face at the university. Please, lead on. Show me where I can rest and put my backpack down. I hope you will be comfortable sharing our camp with us. 2 different departments out here," he mused, jerking his head down after nearly getting struck in the face with a stray tree branch. Riverstock nodded without hesitation, turning and walking back the way he had come, and the forest birds, all the symphony of the eternal song, fell silent, and he and I both froze, not even daring to speak with each other, and I hated the silence. Whenever life went silent, a predator was near. The sound returned, and I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. Don't worry yourself, Doctor." Riverstock stuttered an explanation, his plump cheeks bright red, and cleared the frog in his throat. Well, sometimes nature does silly things, doesn't it?" He excused himself, walking toward the collection of 5 tents in a circle with a collection of tables in the center. Already, things were set up for my arrival, something I was grateful for. "Your tent's the one on the left. I hope everything's to your liking. It's all well, quite bare bones, and—" He cleared his throat, lingering by the door, and stood with his sweaty hat in his hands. "What is it?" "Oh, nothing. I should tell you what the guards warn us about going out late at night and not venturing past the fence line. Just, please listen." "Okay, I guess I'll be going now." He moved his body to the side, moving away from the tent, and I heard him walk away. I was left inside, placed my bag on the ground, and reflected on what I had been told. There were few, if any, foreigners permitted to come into these lands, and I had no desire to disrespect the locals. Perhaps a long-lost predator lurked in the surrounding jungle, and the memory remained in the minds of the populace through folktales. Or maybe not all the visitors had treated their hosts with respect. I wanted to set a good example for others, and hopefully a return visit wouldn't be out of order. The conditions were bare, but I wasn't surprised by this. I sat on my camp bed and opened my weathered journal to check my notes I had written on the plain, focusing on the myths of how the goddess of earth would heal her children by gifting them a fungi. Sometimes there were elements of truth in the myth. Reports previously were that many of the native people were protective over it, and all we had were drawings, reports of sightings, and one photo from the 1960s. So far, no one had seen it since. I ran my fingertips over the photo, hoping I would be the one to find it. My thoughts were disturbed when I heard a commotion outside, shouting and the gathering of voices. They were high-pitched and fearful, while other comforting voices attempted to soothe her, but to no avail. It didn't sound hostile, but definitely people were upset. I stood, opened the tent flap, and saw a group of people standing around arguing while holding a long box that I recognized was the coffin of what looked to be a young child. It was made with a hollowed-out tree trunk, coated in red powder from rocks, and had faded marks on it. Inhaling sharply, I approached, standing between a woman sobbing and an older man shaking his head repeatedly, trying to explain to Riverstock what was happening. Placing my hands up in a peaceful gesture, I stood beside the professor and asked, "What's going on?" "A coffin washed up on the riverbed. I'm puzzled. You see, I talked about taking it back and helping him with the body, but she said the body's cursed." He frowned, clearly troubled and concerned. "How they deal with their dead vary. I don't know yet the reasons for why." I was only half listening. She wept, and speaking in her language that livestock would respond rapidly to, she'd point to the river, then to the village, again and again. "Perhaps she thinks you'll take the remains away." It wasn't the first time explorers had behaved in an exploitative manner toward people. I couldn't understand what he was saying to her in response. She looked defeated, tears staining her cheeks, and shook her head repeatedly. "No, she said the body's tainted. We will need a shaman to cleanse ourselves. It truly is odd. I'd never heard of this before. Mostly the bodies are gifted back to the earth in gratitude for helping. This..." Riverstock leaned closer to me, despite her unlikelihood of understanding me. "Probably some local superstition. Best to play along to not worry him," he whispers. I gave him a skeptical look that he frowned in response. "We may not understand it, but we need to respect it." I nodded my head in silent agreement. We were their guests, and I had no desire to make enemies of our hosts. "Can you ask her how long it would take, and is there a shaman nearby?" I shifted impatiently on the spot, my arms folded, and I glanced at the shoreline, hoping beyond hope to get sight of some in mortui et mortuus, the fungus I'd come all this way for. I wasn't sure what the locals called it, though. He gave me a puzzled look before asking her. I wished I spoke the language so I could ask her personally. I didn't want Riverstock to say something that could come out the wrong way. She said not long, and he lives in one of the neighboring villages. He asked, turns, nodding rapidly in understanding, and then turns to me. He lives among the tree folk. There are different village communities. They all share a language and many customs, yet each have their own specialities, and his eyes lit up with excitement, and honestly seemed happier in the company of the villagers than he did back at camp. I lifted my hands to cut him off. They gathered around the coffin, whispering among themselves, and I noticed that my colleague kept a distance away. Curiosity got the best of me. I blurted out too enthusiastically, "I'd also like to see the coffin and the remains." I paused, remembering my manners and halting my vanity. "If permitted." He blinked, tucking his chin into his neck, and clearly was taken aback by my answer, but he spoke to her. She wept, pointed in the direction and nodded, then shook her head violently. Despite the language barrier, I could tell she was devastated by the news. "Thank you. We will try to help in any way we can," I promised her, hoping she would understand the sincerity behind my words. Riverstock and I walked along the riverbank to see several wooden coffins against it. Some had human remains poking out, damaged from striking against rocks, and the skin rough like leather, with the skin tight around the bones. I've seen human remains previously, so they didn't bother me. I walked and stepped along the shoreline of the river. "Oh, and no photography. They don't like when people do it." He whispered the warning to me. He leaned close, and his double chin wiggled. I don't know. How do we move them? Respectfully, I mean. I don't want to break any bones or drop something. God, it's hot. Riverstock panted, dabbing his face with a handkerchief. The ages of the dead varied, with some that I later learned were pregnant mothers, or those with stillborns. However, all of them were children. I was fixated on the small hand of a child. The skin had pulled taut around the knuckles. If I held it, my palm would easily fit in the center of it. The fingers were twisted, and I could have sworn I saw them twitch, then curl slightly, before releasing back. "Riverstock, yes. How long till the shaman arrives?" I asked, never taking my eyes off the hand. I lowered myself down, resting my weight on my ankles, and deep scratch marks into the roof of the wooden coffin suggested they may have been buried alive. I'd never heard of this practice being done here. I frowned, but didn't comment on it. Well, I don't know. Whenever he gets here, I suppose. He dabbed his forehead with a handkerchief, all in an attempt to keep the sweat from building up. Did they do any kind of human sacrifice? I asked curiously. Riverstock gave me a wide-eyed look of indignation. His eyes darted to our hostess, and I think he believed I was being rude. Then, he remembered they couldn't speak English. He breathed, able to hide his embarrassment. No. The only references to it have been burying dead people in a pit to please one of the gods. It was seen as a devastating and shameful act. So I guess they do, but it isn't looked at favorably, and from what I know, hasn't been practiced for some time. I can't remember the name of the fella. What do you ask? I pointed down to the coffin, moving my finger in the direction of the marks. Scratch marks. It looks like the boy tried to claw his way out. I kept my voice low. He leaned down to closer examine the markings, blinking sadly, and shook his head. No, they don't. He insisted again, then added, Don't say anything. I figured perhaps the boy had an illness that mimicked death, only to be buried alive. Suddenly awakening to the abrupt realization of a close-contained prison of a wooden coffin, I instinctively shuddered at the thought, a fate none deserved. I heard of it happening in graveyards. People would have bells tied to string in case they would awaken. Moments later, the shaman, his body marked with different colors and patterns beyond our understanding. His beard was gray, wise, earth-brown, rich eyes peered through weathered skin, and I instantly felt I was in the presence of someone revered. He stood up to my shoulder, and I struggled to determine whether looking him in the eyes was a mark of respect or disrespect. Patient and wise, with power not simply through title, but through the act itself. He paused to observe each coffin, leaned down and peered inside, immune to the aroma that death brought, and didn't seem bothered other than speaking to one of the nearby men to move the remains out of the river. These he didn't appear worried about. Standing close to me, he studied both Riverstock and I carefully before he spoke in his language. Riverstock listened carefully to translate. He said you must be cleansed before touching the remains, and chants must be given. He paused, spoke rapidly to the shaman, and distracted himself with delving into greater knowledge. I suspected he was asking him what each piece of hardened fruit was, and the name of the knife used, but I couldn't be sure. I waited patiently. A sharp, bordering on pungent aroma rose when they cracked open the shell of an unknown fruit. It was a vivid purple with large green spikes sticking out of it. The inner flesh resembled rotting flesh and smelled even worse. Riverstock gagged into his hand and tried his best to hide it. My arms were smeared with a disgusting gel. The shaman moaned, his eyes first to the heavens, then reaching down to earth, lifting soil from the ground and reciting words repeatedly. His hand outstretched over it, his eyes closed in reverence, and I felt dizzy. My fingertips numb, and I could hear the whispers of the forest. Strange and unseen voices whispered. My knees felt weak, and I forced myself to stand. Are you all right? I heard Riverstock's voice, and soon his round face stared down into mine. I nodded, woozy, and couldn't keep the contents inside my stomach. I vomited up all over the floor. I noticed Riverstock hadn't bothered to assist me to my feet. Once done, I was guided to pick up the coffin and keep the open part away from my chest. I didn't want to think about the contents inside. Following the shaman and the mother down a pathway, the homes were a design I hadn't seen before. Twisted roots, branches, and leaves bound together and encouraged to grow into the tree canopy. They weren't static, and instead swayed gently in the breeze. Above the ground, constructed using smaller branches up into the tree canopy with rope ladders cascading down. I heard the voices of the people speaking, even though I couldn't see them up there. Riverstock would no doubt enjoy spending time here and learning about the people. Carved into the rock was the single building on the ground. I walked over leaves that let out a strong, earthy fragrance when I stepped through and entered the dim room. It was bare, all except the carved table in the middle, formed from the bones of the earth, and placed the coffin on top. Stepping backward, I noticed the mother hadn't entered the sanctuary. Waiting for further instructions, I turned to see if Riverstock would explain anything to me. He wasn't there. What do I do? A long, low groan came from the corpse of the boy, and he stared at me with hollowed-out, semi-rotted eyes. His hand reached out, not gnarling like a beast, but almost gently out to me. I was so distracted I didn't notice the shaman was standing close by, standing by my side. He took powder from a pouch around his belt and blew it in my face. Instantly, I felt my throat tighten and my hands went around my neck. I leaned back on the wall, supporting my weight with my arm and breathing heavily whilst the world span around me. The shaman stood over me, no aggression on his face. He wore a resigned frown and had eyes that had seen too much during the course of his life, and I vomited violently, my contents of my stomach burning as it came up. "What's happening to me?" I demanded hoarsely. Rasping, I tore into my throat when it burned and stared up at the shaman's face, gasping for breath. The image of him becoming blurred and faded in and out. "Listen, we do not have long." His lips did not move, and nor could I usually understand his words. Pain gripped my body. Every muscle and nerve throbbed and twisted. I knew I wouldn't live long. Whatever he had done to me was killing me. How could I understand you?" His words blurred and echoed as I barely clung on to consciousness. "I speak to the dead, and you are on the brink of death. The only way we can speak and not be heard by the undead. The dead were part of a ritual to learn how to protect ourselves from the wicked gods. They held the answers. The dream told us to speak to the dead, and it was performed. However, they deceived us and turned the dead from us. No longer did they care for us and hunted us, devouring us. Don't worry, the wicked gods hold no power in here. The unclaimed dead wander through the jungles at night and will feast on you if you can. We can't enter their temple due to a pact. Help us." I couldn't stand anymore, resting on my hands and knees, my body twisting, and I vomited again. My skin felt like it was on fire, and I had to resist the urge to tear it open with my fingernails. My vision blurred, my throat swelling, and I stared up at him, now barely able to hold my body upright. A forlorn look in his eyes, in otherwise a stoic expression. Despite my desire to assist them, I knew, ultimately, I had no choice if I wanted to live and to make it out of here. "I'll help you," I feebly consented, right before my heart stopped. The shamans blew a second powder in my face, and suddenly I was able to breathe again. I took in a deep inward breath despite the foul aroma surrounding us, choking with a feeling that my body had to become used to the air once more, and breathed a sigh of relief. The boy chattered to himself in words I couldn't understand as I watched the shaman's hand tenderly stroke the boy's hair while he hummed words under his breath. A liquid poured on the remnants of the boy's hair, and soon the boy fell asleep again, cradled tenderly in the shaman's arms, who then bent down to kiss his forehead. The gentle gesture made me rethink what I had assumed. When his eyes met mine, I saw they were wet with tears, and the moment passed. How was the boy able to come alive once more? What were in the different powders? Still dazed, I was led back to the camp by one of the village boys and walked past the river. The other coffins were gone. I noticed the woman's dark eyes lingering on me. When I turned my head to look at her, she looked away, mumbling something under her breath. Once the camp was back in sight, they disappeared into the foliage, and I entered the fence surrounding it. Finally, I was back at camp and made the briefest of pleasantries, a grunt of acknowledgement before I went back into my tent. The locals kept their distance from me and avoided my gaze, leaning close, and whispered to themselves. Riverstock approached me, and when I got back, his hand on my shoulder and leaning close, he studied my face. "Dr. Sear, you look pale. Did something happen?" I barely understood it myself. Without answering him, I sat on my bed with my head in my trembling hands. He didn't wait for an invitation and sat beside me. I couldn't look at him yet. There was a ringing in my ears, and I kept seeing the shaman's face. "You've been gone for nearly 2 days." "What? It was just an afternoon." Yes, 2 days," he insisted. I didn't know how long I'd been gone. It barely felt like a day. I could explain the powder, both the one to kill me and revive me, were both possible. However, the grim, living, dead nature of the body's corpse rising caused me the most confusion. He wasn't fresh, nor close to death. There was no way he should have been moving and interacting with the world. I used part of my water ration to wash my face, noticing the dual-colored patterns on my towel, and stared at them. Either one would be a medical marvel, a gift to humanity in the right hands, and the other devastating in the wrong ones. Their power faded. Outside, I heard Livingstock and the other researchers talking among themselves, preparing the last meal while the campfire burned. Sleep kept evading me, and every time I closed my eyes, the images of being inside the dwelling appeared. I lay on my back, staring into space, trying to rest, thinking about what I experienced, and I wasn't sure how I'd be able to help them, or whether I'd imagined the whole thing. Perhaps they had a type of hallucinogen. If so, why'd they use it on me? I never experienced anxiety, a blessing since many dealt with it every day, and now I felt my chest becoming tight. My fingertips felt numb, and I stared up at them in the faint light. "Excuse me, are you lost?" I heard Livingstock call out to someone. "Excuse me, I'm sorry, but you shouldn't be walking out late at night. It's dangerous." I ignored him for the time being, and heard many footsteps rustling through the undergrowth. Perhaps the villagers had something else they needed to say. I listened. There was a decent amount of them, and I thought it was strange. Normally the villagers moved with relative silence. "Dr. Knight, is that you?" Livingstock astonishingly called out. I remembered the notes concerning the past expeditions, with the most recent one being the 1980s, 1989 to be precise. The party disappeared, having met with the locals and ignored them before they went into the deeper rainforest, where even the locals rarely stepped, the burial regions. Dr. Knight was leading it, and was 40 when he left, meaning he would be 75 now, if I calculated correctly. I shot up, reached out for my machete by the bedside table, and kept it lowered, creeping my head out from the side of the tent, peeking out to see a scrawny man limbering inside, his mouth wide open, with a long, scrappy beard hanging from his chin, and tattered clothing barely managing to cling onto his body. He stopped short, just outside the entrance, with the circled rocks the local people had placed around it for us. I never would have believed it if I saw it. The living corpse pushed once more, then was pushed back by an unseen force. He let out a long, deep moan, and looked from one person to another. A leering grin, and a hand beckoned them to come out with them. Fortunately, none of them did. Livingstock gulped, his mouth open like a fish, and other researchers screamed, huddling around each other. I stepped out hesitantly, and wished to prevent the panic from spreading. "Stay inside the circle," I called out. The others were appearing out of the foliage and circling around the camp and being held back by the stones. I couldn't see any more coming, yet who only knew how many were lurking in the shadows. "They can't come inside," I added. How we were going to eventually escape was a problem for later on. "What is wrong with them?" Livingstock mused, leaned close, but a meter away, and tilted his head from side to side. The food, left unattended, was burning on the pan and sent black smoke up into the air. One of the other researchers took it off, and I went to stand beside Livingstock. It's a curse, but it could be some biological or maybe fungal condition. I don't know. I winced. My head was throbbing, and I closed my eyes tightly while resting my head in the palm of my hand. Livingstock looked at me in horror, and I shrugged my shoulders. The truth was, I didn't know. How could you explain long-dead corpses coming back to life? We'll find out eventually. Our priority is to make sure the locals are okay and to get out of here safely. Ryan, where were you? His eyes lit up, excited. I'm curious about what happened between you and the shaman. He took me to a stone building near the houses and the trees. They let you into the inner sanctum of their village. What an honor, he exclaimed, temporarily forgetting the walking dead outside, circling around the barricades. Can you tell me about it? What did you see? I ignored him. The standing dead body of Dr. Knight stood staring at me, and I felt a tension in my throat, a helplessness that gripped tightly over my body. Suddenly, the corpse jerked upright. A bony finger pointed in my direction, and I felt the tip of his finger poke my chest, despite the distance.
Dead Keeper, move the stones and permit my slaves to enter.
The growling, hissing voice whispered. Pale eyes wickedly locked on mine as a bone finger jabbed in my direction. I stared, dumbly, and saw Livingstock gazing at me, and then back at it. The abject horror clear on his face. Disbelief the legends were based in fact. It's looking at you. It's talking to you. He sputtered. I refuse. Go back from where you came. I retorted, my fists clenched, and I pointed at it. A booming, long laughter came from its mouth and arched its back.
She'll be seeing you soon,
it growled, before all the corpses dropped to the ground, and the forest life began its symphony around us. Livingstock, for once, was speechless. None of us moved to go outside nor touch the corpses. It'll be worse by nighttime. Has there been any word from the locals? I asked, and the silence echoed loudly. Guessing the answer, I knew the safe thing to do would be to remain inside, yet starvation would finally claim us. Livingstock shook his head. I went into my tent to fetch supplies other than my machete. No firearms were brought. I grabbed water, food, and my journal. I doubted there would be enough supplies for us all, yet I couldn't permit them to suffer. Whoa, where do you think you're going? Livingstock demanded sharply, trying to push his frame between me and the exit, his hands on my chest, trying to prevent me from leaving. Dr. Sear, I don't think leaving is... Livingstock, I have to. At the very least, I have to try. I reassured him, a hand on either of his shoulders, and finally he relented, moving and loosening his grip on my shoulders. Yes, you do? I'll come back. I need you to stay here. I leaned close. I don't want them breaking past and running into the jungle. Promise me you won't let them leave. I saw the broken body of a human. His body was frozen in time, dried out in spite of the climate of the weather outside. It didn't make sense. I cautiously stepped over him, trying to avoid the thought of him grabbing my leg and then sinking his teeth into them. Fortunately for me, he remained in place, and I ran in the direction I had been. Every so often I'd slow my pace, wait, and listen for sounds of them coming or sounds of running. It was difficult to hear with how rapidly my heart had been beating. I kept moving, never wishing to remain in one place for too long. The village near the water was completely deserted. No signs of blood or items thrown around as though they were attacked. However, there were no people, either living or dead, and that terrified me. Where were they now? There was too much blood spilled for them to not be more deaths. I walked in a circle before finding my way, trying to find a way back to the tree canopy village, and finally settled my nerves, no longer thinking I made my way there, and I felt my heart sink. There were semi-disemboweled corpses hanging from the ladders. Some had spears and arrows sticking in them. But what good were weapons when you were fighting against the dead? These ones had heavily tattooed bodies, and I wondered why these ones had not turned. Calling out would alert people to my position, and I didn't want to attract them. I climbed up the vine ladder, peeked inside, and checked each one. No signs of life anywhere. The extinction of an entire people frightened me.
You came back for us.
The shaman's voice was bittersweet. I smiled, recognizing his voice, and looked around to see the shaman, only realizing there was no one standing around him. My shoulders sank, and I closed my eyes and wiped the sweat from my brow line. "You're dead, aren't you?" I whispered.
Yes.
I couldn't tell whether this was positive or negative. His voice was not possessed or different from what it was before. An eerie thought crept into the back of my mind, and I stared down at my hands. I could still feel my skin. I moved inside the shaman's cave, several mutilated remains of locals and explorers who came before. On the stone slab was the body of the shaman. Blood patterns coated his chest and forehead, with a ritualistic obsidian dagger in his hand. His mouth was tilted backward, with his jaw ajar, and I regretted losing him. There had been no survivors. Perhaps there were other settlements nearby, but I didn't know where they were.
It's time for you to leave,
his voice said, and I made my way outside. I didn't bother to look back, and walked back the way I had come, wishing to be back home before nightfall. Already the light was fading, and I was unprepared to be out at night.
You can't go back yet.
Why?
You will be cut down with the rest of them.
I was silent. The feeling of being the sole survivor was a bitter one, and I stopped dead in my tracks, uncertainty gripping my soul.
We have one chance. Go to the mountain range behind you. I must show you the secret of what we have been protecting.
Why can't you tell me?
Show, rather than tell.
There was nothing after that. The jungle was completely quiet, with no sound of movement, nor did I see any insect activity. I heard the crunch of leaves litter under my feet, and made my way through areas unseen. I moved a large branch, getting smacked in the face by leaves in the process, and stared in awe at the sight before me. Over the horizon were the ruins of buildings, covered in moss with long-forgotten engravings of leaders and gods worn down through the elements of water and time. I walked toward them, trailing my fingertips over the surface, and trying to piece the civilization I couldn't remember.
Keep going.
The stone staircase was wide, with no railing. Each one was countlessly long in length, and I had to climb down. There were small drains on either side, now the home of a variety of green plants. Broken pottery covered the ground, and old remains of arrowheads and spearheads, some with rusted iron, obsidian, and ones made of stone, scattered in pieces, like the wood having rotted away many years ago. I kept going until the staircase connected with a cave and stopped outside, unwilling to travel down into the darkness.
Move the ball to the right, then forward.
What? I asked. He didn't explain, and without options, I went and ran my hands along it, pulling the weeds and dirt away while wiping it with my hand. It looked like a mirror with a translucent stone inside it. The metal had been overgrown, and I groaned when I moved it, before it slid into place. The sunlight hit the front before sending a beam through the inside, lighting up the entire passageway. With a series of crisscrossed lights. Whoever they were advanced. I slowly walked inside, and on the walls were finger paintings of the dead chasing people. Over time, it would change into a different style of writing, and I wondered how many cultures rose and fell within the jungle. Some nameless, completely unknown to the wider world,
I learned close to observe each one. The deeper I delved, the more unrecognizable the civilizations were. Some were highly advanced, while others were distinctly less so. Each large boulder brick barely had a hair space in between. I ran my finger along the line between the stones. I could have sworn some had buttons, long, immobile. I could see at least 7 different ones. Each one ended with destruction. Your ancestors. My ancestors. The gods' ancestors. All here since time began. He murmured. I moved down through the mountain into the depths of the earth and saw different time periods. I saw large slabs of earth, some with gigantic bones of greater mammals lost to time. Thick layers down to the dinosaurs with large teeth. Thick black lines with fish skeletons and mollusks, only to have vaguely humanoid peoples still attempting to rise against their dead. The rock face showed time. Their ancestors' ancestors. Their gods' ancestors. The shaman wasn't wrong. I heard shuffling and movement, and hid behind a pillar and crept down. The passageway gradually became smaller. Shaman? I thought to myself. Yes. How long has this been going on for? Since the whispers from the water and a star crashed down below. Before our kind walked the earth, the threat was here. It sounded like since time began on earth. It will never end, he whispered, and his voice finally faded. A low, gasping growl emitted, causing an echo around the surrounding caves, only for a song of similar sounds to join until it became a deafening chorus, and I realized that they have been awoken. Nowhere was untouched by the sound, and all I could do was struggle to find a place to hide. I saw humans rising with sagging jaws barely clinging onto their bones and flesh. They stumbled around in various states of decay and began their unholy patrol, walking through the passageways and moving through like many ants. And I stared, pushing myself back in the foliage, hoping to conceal myself inside it to keep hidden. Several walked past me, and I knew it would not end well if they saw me. One caught either sight or scent of me. I'm not sure. A cry rose from every single beast, and they made their way toward me. A slow walk compared to my panicked rush. They had time and persistence on their side, never needing to rest or find nourishment. I kept moving through the vines, hoping and praying I wouldn't feel a hand grip me and pull me back toward the others. I found a gap that gave me room to move, so I ran completely breathless and leapt inside the dark room to hide. I could hear them pull and try to pry the vines apart to follow me through. I saw the undead shuffling around above and peeked out, hoping they wouldn't find me. My eyes slowly adjusted to the change in light. I saw that it wasn't only humans throughout time that had been tortured. The low grunts and moving feet were the only sound that came from their lips, followed by long wails of different beasts. Some human, others not, kept in cages. I saw mammals, reptiles, even octopi and other beings. Suddenly, there were flashing lights with leading in phrases. Some beat, while others sounded like choking gurgles, all in a language that I couldn't understand. I saw a being I could barely see, let alone comprehend. I couldn't look at it for long without my eyes burning and felt invisible. Long fingertips probe deep inside my mind. The god, the alien, whatever it was. I grabbed the crystal and smashed it on the ground in front of me. Releasing its control over my body, I fell backward. My body curled and twisted while it fought me for control. The line between life and death gripped me, fighting when a boy approached me, holding some of the Immortui et Mortuus, mashed it up, and forced it down my throat. I rolled over on my hands and knees, vomited up the thick tar liquid. The boy spoke words I couldn't understand, poured a sweet-smelling liquid on top, and it sizzled in a final, defiant protest. We stared at each other. His body was painted with a red stripe and a small loincloth, and his dark eyes held a grim determination far beyond his age. We were alien to each other. I opened my bag, offered the boy some of the precious fungi since he had used his on aiding me. The boy took a piece and ran away in the opposite direction. Briefly, I watched him for a moment before I watched him leave, hoping one of us would survive, and prayed silently it would be the boy rather than myself. I made my way back to the encampment with a lingering feeling of guilt. Maybe I should have taken him with me. It wasn't right for me to leave him alone. I was greeted with smoke, the tents destroyed and on the ground, with clear signs there had been a panic. The thick trail of blood showed me there had been many victims. Hesitantly, I went inside to grab supplies and a walkie-talkie to connect to the mainland. Did anyone even know we were out here? I only found dead skeletons, and I didn't know why these ones had not been turned. I followed fresh blood behind a box and found living stock hidden behind a fort made with supply crates. He had bite marks on his hefty arms and shoulders. His right leg was missing beneath the knee, with only a bloodied stub remaining. I bent down to wrap it while he murmured incoherently, all in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding and out of extreme measure. I lit a fire, adding fuel, and held a metal pipe against it to cauterize the wound. Biting my tongue, I ignored the pleasant aroma while my stomach growled, while living stock let out a muffled scream. While we made our journey through the jungle, it was slow, and living stock often had to rest. I knew deep down I'd have a greater chance of survival if I left him behind. We never saw any of the undead following us, but saw signs of their carnage. Finally, we got to the docks. Most of the boats were half sank and destroyed, or were long gone with their fates unknown. I heard them. They had completely surrounded us and had followed us to the ocean. I struggled to drag living stock with me, his remaining leg becoming limp and dragged along the ground. He was struggling to push me away, and I placed him down near the office building, one of the few modern ones on the island, before I could speak. I rubbed my face, coated with the blood from my adventures, and stared intently, breathlessly at living stock. The wounds captivated me, and living stock's words pulled me out of it. Go! Go! Living stock snapped at me, irritated, and reloaded the gun. There were only 4 bullets left, not enough to hold them off. They reached through us with grasping hands, open, ravenous, snapping mouths, and with our back close to the sea. Our only source of escape, our options were few. I held him by the arm, keeping a hold of him, and saw the bite marks up close. His wounds were turning septic now. They were swollen and leaking a foul-smelling pus whenever the wound was touched. He would meet his end here. Please, don't let this all be for nothing, he pleaded, and I shook his hand, unable to find the words to comfort him in his final moments, and ran toward the dock. A single, lonely cabin boat remained. The crew likely all perished already, and I leapt inside. Fortunately, someone had already stocked it with supplies of fuel and food for the journey, one I would benefit from. I quickly cast a glance around the area in hopes of seeing other survivors to settle my raging guilt when I released the cleats holding the bow line and spring line, keeping the boat secure, pushing the key to start the choke and turning the key to start the ignition, and drove the boat into the ocean. The sound of gunshots ringing in my ears, roars of the dead, and one final scream, and I knew living stock was dead. The open ocean provided to be long, and even with the supplies I had, I was drastically ill-equipped for the journey. The boat was not designed to travel through large spanning oceans, and I clung on when the waves grew wild. At times, wondering whether this was all a nightmare I would wake from. My supplies were limited, yet the constant pressure of the ocean and the sun burning down on my skin made it difficult. I clung to the in mortui et mortuus, or the gift with the precious fungi inside, a final hope to prevent the menace from spreading. My vision was blurred as I hung over the side of the boat, wondering whether this was all part of a story or if I was simply dreaming. I don't know how many days or nights passed, being in limbo, unable to move forward or back, and I knew I must be close to death when I heard it. I stared up into the cloudy sky, my skin bright red and peeling with every movement, causing me pain. Cracked lips no longer desired fresh water. You can't give up now. I didn't feel that I had much of a choice at this point. You were so close. Am I dying, or are you just a hallucination? The shaman didn't respond to me. I saw a great shadow cast over the boat and shielded my eyes. I heard voices in a language I couldn't understand, and soon saw people lifting me and my boat up. I clung tight to the bag I had brought with the precious cargo, unwilling to be parted with it, when I saw the Japanese flag flying high. Two men talked among themselves when a commanding officer approached and greeted me with a surprising Americanized accent.
You're safe now. We will look after you.
I couldn't speak.
They carried me inside on a stretcher while drifting in and out of consciousness. I never released my journal, nor the piece of fungi. I tried to speak, and a friendly nurse shook his head and told me to rest. Over the coming weeks, I was treated for my dehydration, and when I tried to steal a look at my charts, they took them away and told me to focus on the recovery. They wore white face masks and gloves while they interacted with me. While weakened, they inspected my bag and didn't take any of my items. The captain, an older man with graying hair who was joined by the officer who I met, and spoke to me using him as an interpreter. I reclined on the hospital bed, feeling uncomfortable and waiting for one of the figures to appear at the corner. Though none did. I wasn't sure whether I should be truthful or not. My name is Dr. Sear. I was part of an expedition to investigate in mortui et mortuus fungi for medical purposes. We were attacked, and I need to deliver this back home. I saw the skeptical look pass between them. First, the captain spoke in Japanese to be translated by the officer. Who attacked you? I sighed. I would have thought it sounded crazy if I heard it myself. Still, I had to try. The undead. I think they're infected by something. I need to get back and deliver my findings. Your heartbeat is irregular, and your vitals are showing concerning signs, he answered, ignoring me, and I couldn't resist a frustrated scowl at the response. This was urgent. My health didn't matter. Please, I need to get back, I insisted. It was translated back to him, and I saw a look in his eye. He spoke for a long time in rapid Japanese. The officer nodded to show his understanding, and finally spoke. We see you are unwell. He had paused in an attempt to be diplomatic. We will return you to the U.S. so you may get treatment and return to your people. I noticed that what he said was distinctly less than what he said to me. I was permitted to rest and sleep until I was called up onto the deck. There was an American vessel in the distance, and I was told I would be leaving. I offered my thanks for their assistance and generosity, shaking their heads and bowing in respect. I was taken across on a boat, and it was a relief to hear familiar voices again. Unfortunately for me, this wasn't the refuge, nor easy transport that I thought it was. Within 15 minutes of boarding, red sirens could be heard, and the alert system was blaring through the vessel. It was a blur. Still clutching my items, I ran to one of the smaller boats and boarded with the other survivors. Seeing them run toward me here felt strange. They felt like a nightmare I woke from, only to be plunged back in. How did they get on board? I don't know.
Once on board with the other terrified survivors, 10 of us, when the sergeant noticed one of them had been bitten. The soldier was trying to conceal the bites by hunching over. "I'm sorry," was all that was said when he was shot in the head before unceremoniously thrown overboard. None of the others did anything to protest. While we survived initially, there was the return of the dangers of being on the open ocean. I don't know how long I was on board for. It was either blistering cold or scorching hot. One by one, my companions each died, and I tossed them overboard. Their bodies floated around me, rotting and bloated. No sea life came to devour them. Occasionally, ocean animals would come close, only to spit them out and flee as fast as they could. "It will come," I heard a wickedly familiar voice, and weakly peeked over the edge to see the sergeant's dead face speaking to me. He floated idly, not trying to board the boat. Not that I had the strength to fight him anymore. I lay back, staring into the dark sky, and ignored the whispered taunts surrounding me. I woke up to a weathered gray face and wondered if I was dreaming. I was yanked on board. I murmured in pain and fear to him. I need to get this to the lab." I pointed the journal at him. "Fortunately for you, we're near the coast. World has gone to shit." "The lab, it's San Francisco, California," I answered weakly. "I need to give it to Dr. Roberts. Someone." I wasn't sure I'd live much longer. I could feel my body being on borrowed time. Soon I would be one with the dead. I'd see the shaman's sad, disappointing eyes and wondered about the fate of the boy. Perhaps there had been others who survived. "I'll give you the time you need. Maybe you can put an end to it." I rested until we reached the coastline. I clung to the railing, my freezing hand locked and pawed while the boat swayed from side to side with the motion of the ocean. The grey mist made the world all blur into one, and finally, the glow of the lighthouse offered some hope. The scruffy, grey sea captain. "Good luck, mate. Hope we get it in time. I'll give you an hour, then I'm out." His raspy voice barely heard over the sound of the sea, tying a rope around the cleats to keep the boat secure. Only one rope to make a quick escape. The boat docked among the others, and with eyes closed and on shaky legs, I thanked whichever god managed to keep me safe throughout the journey. I stumbled over the edge onto the dock. Every muscle was tight, and I walked along the door toward the car waiting for me. My bag clutched tightly to my chest in fear of losing humanity's reward. The sun peeked through the clouds, and I felt a renewed sense of hope. The headbeams lit up the way, and I felt myself quickening to a jog when I realized the driver's side door was open. The car was empty. I looked inside, and the keys were still in the ignition. It was still so quiet. "Dr. Roberts?" I asked quietly, thinking she may have needed to visit the lavatory. I heard them long before I saw them. That low, menacing growl, followed by the unhuman laughter that refused to die. It haunted me. Stumbling out from the toilet block, I saw a blonde woman, her jacket torn and her pants down. Clearly, she had been bitten at a vulnerable moment. She leered at me, the unholy smile, and I knew that the dead's dark presence had spread wide indeed. "You were too late." The being's voice rang out. They were drawn to me, a vicious whispering throughout the shoreline as hundreds of the dead walked toward me. I saw some of the zoo animals among their number, equally undead, and didn't waste time trying to determine what they were. I saw images of the boy fleeing through the jungle with the undead hot on his heels. I forced my burning limbs to keep going, and breathed a sigh of relief at the sight of the docks. I ran back to the docks with the zombies hungrily on my heels, only to see the fading boat lights as it disappeared, leaving me stranded. And I hoped beyond hope it would be enough. Perhaps I had left some inside the boat, a trace that fell to the floor, or some hidden enclave of humans with knowledge whispered from their own gods. I dropped to my knees without a gun to ease my burden, and waited for them to take me. You did your best. The shaman's words in my mind before the horde's hands grasped me and teeth sank into me, tearing me to pieces. My skull was cracked open, and I couldn't understand him anymore. I saw the fungus fall from my hands into the water, losing humanity's last and final hope. Unless the boy somehow survived.
Thank you for listening and delving with me into the dark together.
Please remember to leave a thumbs up and subscribe if you feel so inclined. The more engagement this video gets, the more YouTube will push my content to others.
Thus, the following will grow.
All stories read in this channel will be available on Spotify, iTunes, and just about everywhere else. Links in the description.
Thank you for listening and feeding the cause. We'll be seeing you